Today's workshop is Chronic Absenteeism, Truancy and Educational Neglect. I'm excited to introduce you to the presenters from the Vermont Agency of Education and the Department of Children and Families Family Support Division.
Okay, all set, Lindsay?
Yes, I believe we are all set as long as everyone is seeing our screen and slide. Sorry,
Karen.
I forgot to account for where my mute button was, so.
That's okay. And I just saw Heather nod and Karen nod, so that's good. So my name is Alicia Hanrahan, and I am from the Agency of Education. And I'll introduce our folks in a few minutes, but these are the things that we're going to be talking about over the course of the next hour. Our DCF counterparts are going to be talking about educational neglect and truancy, what the difference is between those things, what happens when DCF gets involved, why they get involved, why they might not get involved. And then we're going to talk about absenteeism and protocols, policies, things like that, some options for schools on what they can do to support kids in engaging in their educational programming, some things that families might want to consider doing. And then Heather, our State Director of Special Education, is going to be talking about special education and things that families can think about doing, and schools also think about doing to help support students in engaging in school. So again, I'm Alicia Hanrahan. Heather, if you guys can just kind of wave, this is Heather Willis-Doxee. She's our State Director of Special Ed from the Agency of Education. We have Lindy Boudreau, our Juvenile Justice Director from DCF, and Lindsay Barron is our Policy and Planning Manager from DCF. We also had a little bit of trying to get this together. We had a couple other folks from DCF and AOE kind of give us a little bit of feedback and information, which I'm not going to mention, but because they're not here. But we did have a little extra help in putting this together.
Yes, the teamwork makes the dream work, right?
Very cool. So one of the things to kind of start us off on the conversation, I'm first going to preface the issue of chronic absenteeism and truancy and ed neglect. And in terms of each school district has different policies and procedures. They might have school board policies, they might not. So you've probably all heard this. It's a very localized decision in Vermont. That's how our schools are kind of run. So I like to think that a lot of schools within a supervisory union have the same policies and procedures. That may or may not be true. Definitely supervisory union to supervisory union or school district to school district may have different processes. It all kind of depends. And then when it comes to DCF, there's also different circumstances where you might be trying to support families with whether or not it's a truancy or educational neglect case. It kind of depends on age. We're going to talk about that. Some cases may lead to assessments, others may not. And we'll talk a little bit about that as well. One of the things that we were hoping that you would do is that if you have a specific question, like a case-specific question, that our contact information is at the end of the presentation. It would be helpful if you email us directly. That way there's no, we don't want anybody to kind of come up with personally identifiable information. So specific questions should go to us either at the and you can send us an email and we'll be happy to get back to you. So just a little bit of interesting data that I pulled up. Some of this was from the U.S. Department of Education, and some of it is kind of old, I admit. I did not get really recent stuff. But what they're saying is that over 7 million kids and students are missing school at least 15 days or more during the course of the school year. That's 7 million students. And it did not really have an age range, but I would say it's probably preschool up through 21, 22 years old. So it's about 1 in 6 students. Certainly in high school, it was a little bit more. What was really interesting is that students with disabilities are certainly much more apt to not attend school. There was also some information about gender and race, things like that, on why students might not come to school. And it's COVID-19, I think, in Vermont has really shown us, good, bad, or indifferent, that there are now more kids than ever, I think, who have not been able to attend school for a variety of different reasons. One of them certainly being, you know, a lot of anxiety and depression after kind of being at home possibly for a couple of years. So it's, I think having 90, I think Rachel said earlier, it was like 92 participants in this meeting today. So obviously it's become an issue for everybody. So, which is one of the reasons why we want to address it, because we have seen an increase as well. So I'm going to pass it over to Lindsay.
Thank you. So similar to how we just started with a little bit of the national landscape when it comes to education and approaches and what we're seeing nationally, I'm going to do the same thing when it comes to the child welfare landscape of how educational neglect is either dealt with or addressed. It likely will not shock you that there's quite a bit of variation state by state in terms of how this is handled. I won't read the content to you, but there's variation state by state, and then nationally we're pretty split, almost 50-50 in terms of do state child welfare systems consider educational neglect as a form of neglect, or are there different mechanisms that this is handled? And so Vermont does not fall within the states that have this as part of a formal child protection response and a definition of neglect. Education-related matters doesn't fit squarely within our Chapter 49, which is our guiding statute definitions of neglect. And I will shift to the next slide because this is really the statutory breakdown of how we address and go about our work. And so our authority is split between, they're both in Title 33, but Chapters 49 and Chapter 51 around how we go about this work. And so Chapter 49 guides the majority of our front end responses, and that tends to be physical abuse, neglect, risk of harm, emotional maltreatment. And then through 5106, there's a much more broad-based type of response and assessment that occurs based on whether a child may be in need of care and supervision. That is where we address educational neglect. Through these assessments, there's no question or consideration of whether a substantiation occurs. That doesn't occur as a result of the end of this. But really our work and our approach here is from a holistic approach. How do we partner with the school district? What efforts has the school district already made? And what teaming and natural support building do we need to do to address the barriers to education? Again, this is a lot of words. This is an excerpt out of our educational neglect definition. Sort of the summation is that we're looking for whether a parent or a person responsible for the child's welfare has knowingly either failed to enroll a child in school or is not making the effort needed to get the child to school. So we look at this from an age and a grade breakdown. And so we consider educational neglect beginning at age 6 and going up through the 6th grade. And some of the presumption and sort of underlying beliefs here is that during that age range or grade level, it's generally the parent's responsibility to be getting the kids to school. Of course, that might differ, that might vary depending on intellectual or other developmental disabilities, or just other factors, other circumstances that a parent or a family might be dealing with that is impacting school attendance. When it comes to screening intakes involving school-related absenteeism or reports of ed neglect, we are really coming to this trying to understand what the reason for the absences are. And that is true regardless of what the school district or supervisory union approach or policy is to reporting absences. And so we start with some of the basics. You know, is the student registered for school? What is the total number of absences? How are you counting and measuring absences within your school district? And basically, you know, we're looking for information around what is your work with the parents? What does that entail? What does that look like? What is the parent telling you is the reason for the absences? Is the parent following through with whatever support or recommendations or strategies that the school might be suggesting? Dating back to the COVID-19 pandemic, we were adding additional questions and inquiry around, you know, virtual offerings and understanding, you know, how schools were shifting from remote to in-person and back again. And we were really giving parents and kids a lot of flexibility as we were navigating those uncertain times. Mostly our screening criteria has reverted back to normal, but some of the expectation around efforts that the school is making and efforts to connect and engage, that remains part of the question and the information gathering process that our centralized intake and emergency services staff are asking. So we're also trying to gather information and get at, you know, the reasons for the absences. Are these related to medical conditions or a medical reason that the child might be absent? What is the impact of mental health? And again, following the COVID-19 pandemic, that has been where we've seen such a significant shift in the explanation for young people as to why they're having trouble getting to school. And so we try to be sensitive to the impact of youth mental health and, you know, how the parent is supporting them, how engagement in services and how creativity is being applied to get the attendance where it needs to be. Again, this is a little repetitive, but what steps has the school taken? What does the communication look like? You know, is there something occurring beyond just sending a letter prior to 20 days? What other efforts, what other strategies have been applied? And then also, is the student receiving any kind of special accommodations that they're only receiving in school that is an additional impact on the young person if they're not receiving? This, again, probably will not surprise you at all, but one of the benefits of having a centralized hotline where this information is gathered is that we can gather some themes and gather information that we're just observing statewide. And so we've been finding some pretty significant variation in how absences are counted and defined. And so from one school district to another, you know, excused versus unexcused mean very different things. Some schools are no longer differentiating at all between what those mean. Oops, I'm sorry. And, you know, some schools are sending letters at the 5-day mark, 10-day mark, 15 days, 20 days. Some schools are employing phone calls as a strategy. Sometimes there's even home visits that are occurring. Different school districts have different staffing resources available. So there might be a role that the guidance counselor is taking, the school resource officer is taking. We've also noticed that the SRO role seems to have, a lot of schools have done away with that role. And then more concerningly, there's some schools that have some unenrollment practices after a certain number of days of absences. And so again, this is not a means of passing judgment. It's just us sort of noticing and observing how much variation might occur in practice and how confusing this likely is for families. This is some data for you around what our educational neglect acceptance rate has been. And so this gives a picture pre-pandemic, during the pandemic, and where we stand post-pandemic. And so I think, again, navigating COVID-19 was an interesting time. I think there was a lot of flexibility that both schools and the, you know, departments, state's attorneys applied during the pandemic. I think we saw quite a few filings close to the end of the year, and then a pretty significant spike in 2021, because that is really where the backlog was being dealt with in terms of school attendance issues. And I will pass it over to Lindy.
Great, thanks, Lindsay. So as Lindsay mentioned, there are two different responses from the department. The truancy response is defined in our policy, and that's policy 60. So truancy is defined as a situation that occurs when a child who has completed the 6th grade has accumulated 20 unexcused absences from school. And again, this is a result of their own action or inaction. That's the biggest difference between the educational neglect component that Lindsay was describing and truancy. Next slide, please. So because these situations are seen as being very similar, oftentimes in our policy, we really need to differentiate what the response would be, but also when the department becomes involved with concerns of truancy. So policy 60 guides our workers' response, but also Title 33 also defines the response of the department in relation to truancy petitions, which is the ability to involve or ask the court for involvement related to concerns of truancy. And that's called CHINS D. So it's a child in need of care and supervision. And so when the department has received a request for involvement, we may conduct a youth assessment screening, which is also defined in the statute. That's also found in Title 33. And so when we have accepted a case for concerns of truancy or CHINS D concerns, that is when the youth is between the age of 7 and 16, and the following circumstances exist. There's been an emergency care order, which again has been issued by the court, so there's court involvement. Or a conditional custody order, again, it's a court order, has been issued, or there's a post-merits finding of truancy. And that means that there has been court findings that this situation has occurred and the court has an open case. So that qualifies for the department to open a case related to CHINS D concerns. Lindsay mentioned the variation between school districts. And so a few years ago, there was an ask from the legislature that all schools would develop a truancy protocol. Those protocols differ. There's not an expectation that those would be the same, even from schools that are in the same school district. So when Lindsay was mentioning confusion for families, this certainly plays into that. And I think that, again, this isn't about judgment. It's really about responding to local resources, local need, kind of how schools work together, the constellation of schools within the district, all of those things that vary school to school and county to county. But I mention this because it is hard when we're trying to have a uniform response to concerns of truancy, when things like defining a local school's acceptance for unexcused absence versus excused absences, and how they count days absent, all of that differs. So that might be something that families and youth have different experiences with, depending on where they have lived over the course of a young person's academic career. So for us, when we're looking at conducting youth assessments, we'll often ask for folks to look at follow the truancy protocols before reports are made, and work with local providers, such as like a balanced and restorative justice provider is a local provider that DCF contracts with, that can help provide supports to schools and young people and their families when they're experiencing symptoms of truancy. And so Lindsay mentioned the 5, 10, 15-day letters. Oftentimes what will happen is the department may be copied on one of those letters, but the first response is, let's reach out to a BARD provider and see if they can help work with the family and the young person around identifying the concerns that are leading to absenteeism and develop a plan to prepare for school readiness. Next slide. So as I mentioned, because there are sometimes confusion and similarities to these cases in our policy. This is from policy 60. We wanted to provide a grid. So for folks who are doing the work, but also folks who might be inquiring, these are the categories or kind of the circumstances by which we would respond in different ways, whether it be the front end response that Lindsay was talking about, educational neglect, or the truancy response. And so again, you can see the first two boxes are what Lindsay was talking about in relation to a front end response with educational neglect concerns, where the responsibility sits primarily with the parent to ensure that the youth is getting to school. The middle section here is related to the enrollment of a youth in school or an approved AOE homeschool program. And then the last box is talking about, again, truancy cases. And again, this is more about the youth is responsible for, or has the brunt of the responsibility around getting themselves to school. And so this, again, is in policy 16, is really just meant to provide some clarity around when we'll be accepting or moving forward with opening either a front end response or a youth assessment related to truancy concerns. So when I'm mentioning youth assessments, that's a term that's in statute. So when we're conducting youth assessments related to concerns of truancy, we really want to take a look at holistically what's going on for the youth and their family and what's going on at school. And so we want to make sure that we have a social worker who is assigned who will take a look at all of those circumstances together, because we certainly know that somebody who's experiencing issues at school or issues at home, that bleeds over into one another. And so there may be circumstances that are happening that folks are not aware of at school that are making it difficult for that young person to get to school. So through this process, we'll interview the family, the youth, the school, collateral contacts, and try to get a full picture of what's going on to identify the challenges, but also the strengths, see where there might be opportunities to build on natural connections within the family and for the youth to kind of help support, again, school readiness and talking through those issues that were identified that were barriers for getting to school. That might be, like Lindsay mentioned at one point, maybe mental health concerns, or there's transportation issues, or whatever it might be, really looking at all of those together to say, how can we support this situation and this youth so that they can get to school and engage and be active in their academic learning. So again, as this last bullet talks about, it's really about getting a clear view of the youth and the family and their system as a whole, and looking at where there might be opportunities from either the natural supports within the family, the community, the school, and a combination of that to make sure that there is a plan developed to support the youth in going to school. And I think I'm going to turn it over to Alicia.
Thanks, Lindy. So one of the things that I wanted to mention is definitely the compulsory attendance is from ages 6 through 16. So if students are certainly not required to attend school if they're 5, we certainly want kids to go to kindergarten and we want them to go to preschool, but that's not a requirement. And then that's compulsory attendance, which is 16 VSA 1121. And then for 1123, superintendents can excuse students from attending a definite time, but not for more than 10 consecutive days. Whether it's an emergency absence from town, like if you go on vacation, things like that. One of the things that Lindy mentioned earlier was the fact that some kids are kind of automatically unenrolled at 10 consecutive days of unexcused absences. And that's a requirement that AOE has, and I believe it's due to the average daily membership, or ADM. So there's in state statute, there's a definite difference between what is considered to be an excused absence and what is considered to be an unexcused absence. So again, looking at the compulsory age of 6 through 16, you've got, they fail to enter school at the beginning of the academic year, being enrolled, fails to attend school. There's lots of different reasons why a student may be excused or unexcused, certainly depending on illness, family death, things like that. Vacations are probably more unexcused than they are excused. It really all depends, again, on each school district needs to have their own policy and procedures, or at least, they have to abide by the definitions that are in state statute, but it all kind of depends on how they individualize them based on school. One of the things that's interesting is that you have the responsibility, or the school has the responsibility to notify the truancy officer. And I know that a lot of school districts, at least in the last couple of years, certainly post-COVID, a lot of families have been not necessarily taken to task by the school district. And so I often get phone calls where, the student has been absent for the last 40 days. Well, have you followed your procedures, or have you notified the truancy officer that you have for your district? I know that schools want to work with families as best they can, and not always necessarily following their procedures. If you can run to the next slide for me, Lindsay. So here's the piece about the truancy officer, and it's definitely in state statute. There needs to be written notices to the parent or guardian. There could be a fine, and I don't think in a lot of places that these procedures are necessarily being followed. The truancy officer then also needs to go to the state's attorney if it's becoming a problem, and then the state's attorney shall prosecute. I'm not sure if in a lot of instances in Vermont, if this is something that's happening. Certainly we want to err on the side of caution in case there are some reasons why a student isn't attending school, but then also working with, whether it's DCF, because DCF certainly gets a lot of calls to their centralized intake about kids not attending school. Working with DCF, working with the school district, working with the family, even working with the truancy officer or somebody else within the school district who can help support the kid and the family is certainly the best way to do it. What's interesting is that a lot of places across the U.S. are identifying what we're really kind of talking about. So we've got educational neglect, we've got truancy, and the word chronic absenteeism is coming up a lot. And if you take a look at Attendance Works, which is one program that I listed at the end of the presentation. So it's got a lot of resources. It's really well done. Vermont does not have a definition for chronic absenteeism, but it's something that we're kind of looking at, and is it something that we can maybe put into state statute in the future? It's something that I think it would be helpful to have a definition in state statute. And really what I've seen from a lot of different places, what they're doing is missing 10% of the school year is really what others are considering to be chronic. So in Vermont, we have to go to school 175 days, and in other places it might be 180. I don't know. I think the requirement is 175 by state statute. And so that means a student is missing 17.5 days of school each year. And so every time a student misses, several days, it certainly means that they're going to have a little bit of a hard time catching up. Certainly in high school, you're missing a variety of different things to help move you forward to graduation. Certainly, younger kids are missing some of the core instruction that they need to learn how to read and write, and those types of core academics. What's interesting is that they've lumped in here for chronic absenteeism, excused absences, unexcused absences, and suspensions. So one of the things to think about at some point is in-school suspensions versus out-of-school suspensions, and whether or not students can get access to their school content if they're with their same age peers at all. And that's something that certainly we would be looking at if we get to a point where we're going to be defining chronic absenteeism to take forward to the legislature to add into, or at least maybe not add into state statute, but maybe even modify what we already have in place. So these are some of the things that I came up with and asked a couple of special ed folks, and also one superintendent in particular, but then I also got some information certainly from Attendance Works as well, and a few other places that I looked at. So we're really looking at a variety of factors about why students are absent and they're not engaging in their educational programming. And certainly you have out-of-school factors, in-school factors, disengagement. You certainly have, you know, kids who have chronic health conditions, and that certainly makes sense. I think you've also got a lot of kids who are caring for siblings. They might be doing some elder care for family members who might be ill. Certainly there is some housing instability. There's mental health concerns that families and students are both experiencing. And of course, those are the things that are happening, you know, the 2/3 of their day where they're not in school. And then you also have kids who are experiencing hazing, harassment, and bullying, feeling unsafe in school. You know, they might have some social anxiety, some academic anxiety. You know, if you're missing a lot of school, of course, you're going to feel behind and then struggling to keep up with your peers. And, you know, that certainly becomes more apparent the older the students get. And if they're kind of getting, I don't want to say pushed along into the next grade, but sometimes that does happen and they're not ready to go on to the next grade because they've experienced so much time out of school that they're not ready. They can't catch up on some of those core academics that they need to have. Transportation is always an issue. Certainly if families are homeless, then there's an issue with how is the student getting to school? Are they, you know, living in a different district? How can they get, you know, the families might not have adequate transportation, so they need to figure out how to get their students to the closest bus stop. There are a lot of factors that certainly affect kids getting to school. And then there's disengagement from the family or the students. So they don't see the point of going to school. Some older students certainly would much rather be in the workforce, helping their families survive and adding some money to their family checking accounts, and trying to make sure that they do have housing, they do have food available for their family. You know, some kids feel like they're a bunch of failures. We didn't, you know, they might have undiagnosed disabilities for whatever reason, or were able to cope when they were a little bit younger, a little bit differently. So feelings of failure and not being able to, again, catch up with their typically developing peers. You know, there's some denial. Some families will say, my kid's okay. My kid's okay. He's just struggling a little bit. You know, we'll get him to school as soon as we can. But really he's doing, or he or she is doing okay. You know, not to worry, school. We know what we're doing. So this is one of the things. So this was from Attendance Works, and they did a little bit differently than I did. So there's barriers, negative school experiences, lack of engagement, misconceptions. Certainly, I think, you know, one of the misconceptions that we probably don't talk about as much is that in school versus out of school suspension, and how that also affects their absenteeism and whether or not those numbers are being counted. So, and that again would be a little bit different, you know, depending on what school you go to. Another misconception is, you know, sporadic absences aren't necessarily a problem. So if the student misses 3 days at the beginning of the school year, 3 days in the middle, 3 days at the end, it's not as big of a deal. But it, you know, it certainly can progress depending on the student, depending on the family. So go ahead, Lindsay. Thanks. So the next several slides really are taking a look at what different schools are doing currently and what schools can do. So taking a look at the students, each individual student, certainly you have to take a look at them and take a look at what we're collecting in schools for data. So there needs to be a decent tracking system. Some schools employ attendance kind of teams. So taking a look at the individual students, taking a look at, are they always missing chemistry? So what's the first, reason why kids are missing chemistry? Do these particular kids not like chemistry? Do they not like the teacher? Is it too early in the morning because they worked late the night before? Are there reasons? Are there kind of a root cause to some of those? Do the schools need to take a look at some of their policies and procedures? In terms of, we send letters to families every 5 days, 10 days, 15 days, however it works. I know I've gotten them in the past when I was taking my kids out to go to Florida to visit my parents. So I would tend to get some of those letters as well. Is there those letters that are sending out? I attended a workshop recently where they're like, if you soften up the language in the letter and not make it seem like it's a punitive issue and it's more of, we want your kid in school, how can we work together? And I think that's really the attitude that we all have to have, is we want these students to be in school and we want them to be engaged, and how is it that we can do this as a team? And so is it looking at, again, your policies and procedures? Is it looking at developing action plans or attendance plans for specific students, or school district wide? How are we doing, Lindsay? There we go. So, school districts certainly need to have high expectations for students, and that's, we want these kids to be in. Sorry, that was my mother. We want to have high expectations for kids. We also need to look internally at our current staffing. Do we have, as a school district, do we have homeschool coordinators and our resource officers and social workers, and what do we have for mental health supports? I think probably one of the things that post-COVID we're seeing is a lot of kids with increased anxiety and depression, and most likely a decrease in staffing to support those issues with kids and with families. And some of the students that previously pre-COVID would have been kind of on the school radar for truancy may still be on the radar for truancy, but I think some of these other kids who were always seemingly doing very well have come back into the school with a lot more anxiety and depression. So they're now missing a little bit more school. And actually in the last couple of years, we've seen an increase in families putting their kids in a home study program or a homeschooling program because the students aren't able to get to school. So the families are thinking about homeschooling them so they continue to get their academics. One of the things that I put at the bottom of this slide is certainly communication and partnership. So making sure that everybody is on the same page. The communication with the family, whether it's through phone calls, emails, letters, again, maybe softening some of those letters up a little bit so it's not accusatory. Lots of things that can be done, but making sure that there's open communication with schools is certainly crucial. Certainly looking at school climate, one of the presentations that I sat in on yesterday was really all about school climate, and is it a safe environment? And have you done a climate survey recently to see how kids are and families are feeling about their school? Taking a look at their discipline procedures and policies, taking a look at the hazing, harassment, and bullying data. Is it a safe community for families and students to feel safe in? Certainly providing guidance about when to actually keep students home. For illness is a big deal. You know, if a student has a little bit of a cough, they can probably come to school. If they're really, really ill, then you keep them home. Certainly school districts can provide literature and different YouTube presentations, things like that, anything that can support encouraging families to send kids to school and trying to get students engaged in school. There are certainly ways where families can be a little bit creative, think outside the box. So can we look at partial day programming for students? Can we look at shortening school days or having students come in late? Is there something to do for credit recovery? Can we provide social skills groups or, you know, lunch buddies? One of the things that's super important for kids is to have connections with students for sure, but also with adults. One of the things that I heard about recently is a school put up like little stickies on the wall with each student in their school's name on it, and each staff member had like a sticker. And so you would go through all of the stickies and put your own personal sticker on the sticky, and you get to the, you have all of your staff members, including folks in the lunchroom or the bus driver or the school nurse and the social workers, you know, anybody who might have a connection with a student, and focus on the kids who don't have any stickers on them, which means they don't feel like those kids have any connections. Having an adult to connect with is super important for kids and will help support them to be engaged in school. If they feel like somebody really wants them there and is going to enjoy having them in school, kids will feel a better sense of belonging. One of the other things to think about is taking a look at, for older kids, taking a look at PLPs or personalized learning plans and seeing how we can make sure that those PLPs have students with areas of interest. I mean, I don't have much interest in biology, no offense, so I'm not going to put as much effort into reading a biology textbook as I would putting it into something else that I'm interested in. So having, now that's my personal view. I don't like biology. I don't want to say, don't want anybody else to think they don't need to learn biology, but that's just me. But making sure, I mean, everybody will have some sort of interest, and if we can tailor some things to their interest, that would certainly be helpful. And I know I'm coming close to my end. Maybe Lindsay, if you can, thank you. So again, what are some things that some families can do? Certainly, I've got a couple of slides on this, but there can be so many more things than what I put in here. You know, talking to your school, being active in your kid's school life, whether it's attending concerts or attending, you know, parent-teacher conferences, talking to the professionals in the school to say, my kid's struggling, what can you help me with? What can we do? Can we put a plan? Can we wrap our kid up in something that makes them feel like they can come to school and learn and be safe and wanted? Is there a reason to have, you know, to suggest that the student may need counseling? They may need to have a conversation with their medical professional. Does the student need some medication for their heightened anxiety? Or do they need to have their anxiety meds changed a little bit? And that's certainly a personal preference. The school district will never say your student needs to have medication. But that's a personal preference if that's something that the family wants. Talk about coordinated services plans with your local designated agencies like the Howard Center, Washington County Mental Health. If there's some additional supports that maybe can be put into play. There may be referrals for 504 plans, EST plans, special education. There's lots of different things that families can do, certainly to advocate for their students in attending school. having
Yeah,
having
Alicia,
high.
you are just about out of time. Just
I know
quick
it.
time
I
check.
know it. Thanks, Karen. I think asking the students to locate a mentor, and again, having students with a connection is so important for all students. How am I doing, Lindsay? Do I have any more? Oh, phew. Okay, and I'm gonna hand this off to Heather.
Hi, everybody. My name is Heather Willis-Doxee. I am the Director for Special Education at the Agency of Education here in Vermont. I wanted to be able to share with you some specific strategies and considerations for students with disabilities, whether those students may be supported through an individualized education program, IEP, or a Section 504 plan. So some of these strategies are more so geared towards parents who may be listening, but they're also great for practitioners and school personnel to just be familiar with this information and work through at your school level teams of how you're going to support students with disabilities who may be affected by chronic absenteeism or some of the other categories that we talked about today. One of the first things is I would always encourage a parent if you, and this goes for the school as well, if you have a student who's been identified with a disability who you are having attendance concerns with, you always, either the school or the parent can initiate or request an IEP meeting or a 504 meeting to address those concerns with the team. You do not have to wait until the annual IEP meeting comes up. You can convene a meeting or request to convene a meeting at any time throughout the school year. And during that time, talking about what supports may be needed for that student to ensure that they are able to attend school so that they're receiving their specialized instruction and related services will be important. Another option that could be considered by an IEP team or perhaps even a 504 team would be conducting a functional behavioral assessment to determine the root cause and patterns for behavior. Sometimes we think about a functional behavioral assessment for external behaviors only, but this could be something that's an internalizing behavior that you may see that may be preventing the student from attending school. So that could be something that could be requested that the team consider. And then in addition, once root causes and patterns of behavior have been determined, the team could consider whether or not a positive behavior intervention plan would be needed to support the student with the goal of increasing attendance at school. Next slide. Some of the key players that you may consider having at the table when discussing attendance concerns for students with disabilities would be the school's social worker, the school psychologist and counselor. Those are examples of great team members that could be brought in to consult over the concern. Another strategy that I wanted to share would be considering using a home to school communication log. So that way the school and the parent are communicating and partnering together to see, once you do identify what strategies would be helpful to implement for the student, how are they going? And then the parent can say, well, this is how my child is perceiving these interventions and strategies were put in place. Are they being successful? Also, if there was something going on where there might be some anxiety or something that would be helpful for the teacher to know, having that school communication, whether it's a notebook or an electronic means of communicating, whether sometimes teachers may use an app called Class Dojo or the Remind app or something of that nature. There's lots of different ways to implement a communication plan to increase that communication between the parents and the school. Next slide. One thing that could be considered, these are specific to students who have an IEP, not necessarily a 504 plan, but you could consider whether an IEP goal related to attendance should be added to a student's IEP. and consider whether a reevaluation to include psychological evaluation may be necessary. Sometimes there may be a negative stigma associated with if a team or a parent were to request perhaps a psychological evaluation. And I'm just hoping to name that here and to take that stigma away, to say sometimes if there is a concern for a student who has a lot of anxiety about attending school, you may, I'm not saying it has to happen in every instance, but if the school team has tried different interventions and plans and strategies with the student and there's still continuing to be concerns, bringing in and getting that outside of, the evaluation from the school psychologist, or whether that's outside help that the parent has sought, would be great information to bring back to the IEP team for problem solving and planning. Next slide. I have some examples that you're going to see in the next few slides about specific related services that can be considered by an IEP team or a 504 team to support a student in receiving a free appropriate public education. I do want to note that sometimes it may come up the difference between, well, why is my student being served on a 504 plan? Or do I need to consider, does my student need an individualized education program to receive specialized instruction? And I think that's just the difference, the main difference right there would be if a student requires specialized instruction to receive a free appropriate public education, that's when school teams should start looking into, would an IEP be the most appropriate plan to cover the student? I do want to name that when I share these examples of related services, the list is not to be considered a one-size-fits-all plan for all students, saying that we need to put all of these on a student's IEP or 504 plan. These are just to serve as examples of supports that can be provided when appropriate and identified by a school team. And again, that last bullet right there, I've already covered that. If a student's disability is severe enough to require related services and any specialized instruction, a team should get together to look at all available data to determine if a student meets eligibility criteria for a student with a disability under IDEA. Okay, next slide. One of the related services that can be considered by a school team for a student would be student counseling. And I'm not going to read the definitions that IDEA has for each of these, but we will be providing a copy of the presentation to the participants, so you'll be able to go and do some more research if you have questions around specific related services. But student counseling is an option. It needs to be tied specifically to a goal and the present level section. If it was a student who had an IEP, the need for that service needs to be outlined and it needs to be tied to an IEP goal. Next slide. This is a related service that's often overlooked and may not be considered, but I did want to bring this up because I think this is a great example of a related service when it comes to supporting students who have attendance concerns. Parent counseling is also a related service that can be considered by a team to support the student's parents. And whether that's in understanding if a child has a specific health need or a specific need that's kind of contributing to the student's attendance concerns, helping parents work through that and understand and even strategies that is an allowable related service. Next slide. We talked a little bit about, for students who have continued ongoing attendance concerns, one of the things a team might consider would be if a psychological evaluation was needed. That can be part of the related services, but also bringing in a psychologist to assist with things that could be assessments. But also, I like to point out the fourth bullet down that talks about using a school psychologist to consult with other staff members in planning school programs to meet the special education needs of students, and being a part of that. And that last bullet in particular will highlight the school psychologist could be a team member that could assist in developing positive behavior intervention strategies. So they are an important team member to include when doing problem solving. Next slide. School health services. That's another example of a related service the team may need to discuss. And having a school health service provider, a lot of times schools may employ a school nurse, and they could be brought in to be part of the problem solving team as well. Next. Utilizing social workers to be problem solvers and part of the conversation is really important as well when we look at the issue of attendance. Social workers can be involved in providing counseling services and also helping to develop positive behavioral intervention strategies. But not only that, being a great connector. I know Heidi Shoemaker, who's on the call today, has put a couple things in the chat, and I just want to acknowledge that. Utilizing your school social workers to also connect families to outside resources is an important part of the problem-solving process. Next slide. Transportation is another related service that can be considered for a student. Perhaps if a student who has been identified with a disability and that disability is impacting their ability to participate at school and even get to school, transportation services can be addressed by the school's IEP or 504 team as a possible related service to help target and get the student to school. Next slide. I wanted to end with just a couple of examples of supports that as a parent, maybe you might want to ask your school about the team that's supporting your school child at school. And also for those who work in a school system, these are things that can also be considered to support students with attendance concerns. One of them is a program called Check and Connect, and there may be a similar system that your school district could employ or already may have in place. And that's a really great idea when you're trying to connect students to a caring adult at school, where they're checking in with them each morning and they're checking in with them at the end of the day. I've worked in schools before that had that. We used to have Check and Connect like quarterly parties where you would get in and celebrate attendance and celebrate the successes of the students when they were matched with, it's almost like a mentor at the school who is checking in with them each day. That's one option that could be discussed. Trying to talk about what non-academic or extracurricular opportunities exist to find a way to motivate the student to be engaged with their school and kind of thinking outside the box of the school day. What other draws would there be to include students and get them involved in their school? Discussing with your child, there's two more, sorry. Discussing with your child's school the option of developing a specific attendance plan. And then the last one is making sure that we're involving the students and helping to identify what are the barriers that are being posed to their attendance and getting their input for what would help motivate them. And so I just want to name keeping the child involved, the student involved is an important aspect. We didn't spend a lot of time talking about that today, but we'll end on that note. Just making sure that this is student focused and involving them in the process. Thank you.
So thank you, Heather, and everyone else. I just want to remind folks that we do have an evaluation link in the chat. And it would be really great if folks could take time to fill that out. We share those with our presenters too, if there's information that can help them. I know we are at 2 o'clock. We can continue running this, as because we tape it, so we understand people are going to jump off. But certainly if they have questions, and I know that a couple of the presenters can stay beyond 2, I'm just looking to see if there are any questions in the chat, because what we could do, Lindsay, is you could stop sharing and folks can, unmute themselves and ask questions. That might be the easiest, given that we are short on time. So I don't think I saw specific questions in the chat.
I think there was a request for Alicia to write up the sticky note example, so we can follow up with that or even add that to the slides that we
And
just.
Right.
Lindsay, I put that in the chat too. That strategy that Alicia mentioned, it's called relationship mapping. And so if someone, I tagged Elizabeth in the comment, but if you are interested in finding out more, all you have to do is do a quick internet search about how to do relationship mapping in a school setting, and the protocol will come up.
Yes, and I do see the other comments in chat have to do with other resources, from the American Academy of Pediatrics to school nurses and mental health clinicians. I do have a quick question. If I'll take a look to see if anything pops up in chat, but this would be for the Agency of Education. So it's acknowledged that schools are sort of variable and all over the place with maybe definitions and practice. So is there a way for there to be more uniformity?
You're asking a lot, Karen. So that's a good question. I don't know. Lucky for me, that's below my pay grade. It would be nice. I don't know if there's going to be any movement towards that. It's certainly something that we can talk about on our end. I can certainly have that conversation with my direct supervisor. But I don't know if that's something that we're going to do. We do a lot of local control types of things, but it certainly would be helpful if we had something that was uniform across the state.
Yeah, because that in itself leads to a lot
Sure.
of confusion for families.
Absolutely.
So Karen, I'll just add, and then I have to step off, I apologize, but there has been conversations with my DCL and AOE folks, namely, Alicia's been a part of that, Anne, who's now the interim secretary, and Heather as the secretary. We've had conversations about exploring where we might be able to develop some uniformity. It certainly would be a lengthy process. We would need to involve folks at the local level, but we have identified a need for that, and interest certainly exists. And a desire to roll up our sleeves and look at where we might be able to have joint definitions. Would that require policy change? Would that require legislative changes, et cetera, et cetera? So we're starting to have those conversations. So I'm hopeful that can lead to some uniformity around through both Agency of Human Services and Agency of Education. But I do need to leave. My meeting just started. It was great to present to you all today. Nice.
Thank you, Lindy. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And just one quick question sort of associated with the last one. I think, Alicia, you mentioned something about pending legislation, or maybe thoughts about pending legislation. So I guess in 10 words or less, something really short. But
So, yeah, so that would be about chronic absenteeism, coming up with a definition and kind of going from there. We're in the initial stages of talking about it. We've had some conversations with DCF as well, because we would probably need to have some work done with educational neglect and truancy, and making sure that they all kind of fit together, so we can not necessarily have a united front, but at least have them connected in some way. It certainly isn't anything that we'll be able to introduce in this legislative session for sure, because we're already past crossover, but hopefully in the future, that's something that we're hoping that we can work through.
Okay, and I guess one last question. I'll just read it. I'm trying not to make this a specific question, but what if attendance cannot be a goal because it is harmful? What if the school environment is damaging or overwhelming to the child? What would a school district be open to excused absence to rest and recover over a longer term, weeks or months? So I guess that's a question for Heather.
I think that's a question that needs to be brought back to the school's problem-solving team, whether that student is covered by a 504 plan or an individualized education program plan. I think that's a question that's best brought to that school team to discuss, what is going on, what are the identified barriers, and what supports could be put in place. Does that look like an at-home learning plan? I'm not sure, because we have to take into consideration if an extended break is offered or the student is not attending school for an extended period of time, what negative impacts could have on being able to provide the students the either specialized instruction and or related services that were identified to help that student make progress in their education. And so I would shy away from plans that maybe would take a break from giving the services that the whole team has agreed upon that the student needs to make their progress. So it really is going to come back to the planning that's needed to ensure that students still get in their free appropriate public education.
Okay, well, thank you. Now that we are about 10 after, I know that you have engagements as well. So thank you all for this helpful information. And we do have more VFN workshops coming up. So for folks who want to check it out, that information is on our website. So thank you, everyone, and have a great day.
Okay. Thank you, guys.